It's great to be joined today by S. Matthew Liao, who is the director of the Center for Bioethics at New York University, also author of The Right to Be Loved and Moral Brains, the Neuroscience of Morality. There's so much to talk about here, and I think maybe a good place to start is, when we talk about neuroethics, what are we talking about?
So basically, there are two branches of neuroethics. There's something called the ethics of neuroscience. So this is sort of ethical issues arising out of novel, new neuroscientific technologies. So things like there are fMRI, which are sort of functional magnetic resonance imaging. There are sort of different diagnostic tools. There are different drugs, psychopharmaceutical drugs that one can take. And all those different new technologies raise a host of ethical issues. So for example, there are implications for things like addiction, borderline states of consciousness. There are issues about erasing memories, and so on.
Let's talk a little bit about, to dig into one of those issues, the erasing memories idea. And this is an idea that the last 100 years of science fiction have opined a lot on that hypothetical technology. You have a great TED Talk actually available on YouTube, which I encourage people to check out, which deals a little bit with this idea of erasing presumably painful memories from someone's past. Talk to us a little bit about the concept and what the ethical issues involved are.
Sure. So it turns out that a lot of people right now, they experience trauma. So for example, soldiers coming back from war, many suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. I think about 23 veterans commit suicide each day. So it's quite a really serious problem. And right now, there are new neuroscientific technologies that may allow us to ameliorate some of these effects. So one drug is something called propranolol. And this is something, it's a beta blocker. So it's something that you take when a very traumatic event happens. And what that does is that memories have to be consolidated from short-term memory into long-term memory. So when you take that beta blocker, you can block the consolidation process, or at least dampen the consolidation process. And in that way, the hope is that it would make the post-traumatic stress less sort of serious. There are other technologies. There's something called deep brain stimulation that people are using. So another theory about post-traumatic stress disorder is that it involves hyperactivity in the amygdala. So basically, the amygdala gets that's the emotional center of the brain. And so deep brain stimulation is something, it's an electrode that you place into your brain, into a specific part into your brain, and then it's connected to a battery pack. And you can turn the electricity up or down, and they'll then send, the battery pack will send electricity into the brain and thereby disrupting signals in the brain. And so the idea there is that somehow you can maybe disrupt disrupt the post-traumatic stress disorder. And more speculatively, sort of scientists have been uncovering something that's really novel right now, is that they've realized that each time we recall something, so every time we remember something from the past, the memory needs to reconsolidate. And what that means is that it needs to put itself back together. And that process of reconsolidation requires new proteins. Some people have thought that it involves something called PKM zeta. And so the idea is that if you somehow use something to stop that protein from forming itself, you can very selectively erase certain parts of the brain. And it would be kind of like the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Right. So, I mean, Matthew, at face value, this all sounds great, right? But of course, these ideas are not without controversy. What are the opponents to some of these technologies arguing as the basis for their opposition?
Yeah, so many people are worried about just some people might use this to harm other people. So you can imagine a criminal who commits a crime, perpetrates a crime, but then gives the victim a drug, kind of like the date rape drugs, and then the victim doesn't remember. That would be really, really bad.
Hmm.
And then there are also issues about whether some people worry about whether we have a duty to remember. Maybe there's maybe their duties to remember traumatic events. So these soldiers in war, maybe some people think that maybe they should try to remember the atrocities of the war so that they can tell the rest of the world, so that we don't repeat the past again. And so there are issues like that. There are also more subtle forms of self-harm. So memory is something that we use to, they're meant to represent what happened, what in fact happened. So if we start tinkering with what in fact happened, we might start to have a bunch of false memories, and that could be very troubling. So as a soldier, you might take this pill, and then you might think that you didn't really want to kill the enemy when in fact you lusted after the killing. And so issues like that, those could be really troubling.
I don't know if
Another
you've
one
seen,
is
I don't
sort
know
of,
if you've seen season 3 of Black Mirror, but there's an episode in that which very, very closely approximates the issues with military that you're referencing right now.
oh yeah, I think I've seen that episode.
Yeah.
It's really great. It's exactly what I've been thinking about.
And Matthew, when we
uh,
talk about you mentioned fMRI.
uh-huh.
I'd love to talk a little bit about that. And there's a controversy. There are some in the philosophy world who
Hmm.
believe that there's really not much value in using neuroscience to determine what is of moral significance or ethics to humans. And they look at some of the experimentation that's being done with fMRI under sort of ethical, moral decision-making situations as being kind of a waste of time. I'm guessing you don't agree, and I'd love to hear from you why.
Right. So I think that, I mean, I think it's an empirical question, but also a normative one, whether fMRI or some technologies, like neuroscientific technologies, will have ethical implications. Let me sort of step back and just roughly present the ideal scenario.
Yeah.
So the thought is something like, um, imagine that, so all of us, when we make moral decisions, we use our brain. And to do that, like some of us think that we think that we're moral agents, so we make decisions in a very rational manner, right? We think about the pros and cons, and we really deliberate about them, and then we come to a reasoned decision. But suppose that it turns out to be the case. So suppose we put ourselves under fMRI or some sort of brain scanning technology, and we find out that every time we could make a moral decision, what happens in the brain is really that we're just kind of flipping a coin, right? Just to be dramatic,
Yeah.
right? In that case, it seems like you might start to wonder whether our decisions are any good, assuming that flipping a coin is not a reliable way of getting at, say, moral truths. And so that's sort of the ideal scenario, is that if it turns out that when we make moral decisions, we're just kind of making up stories or confabulating or flipping coins, then that's a problem for the way we make moral decisions.
Well,
And it turns out,
when I read
yeah,
some of the statements from philosophers that say there's no value here, I'm sort of
right.
reminded of the writings of Daniel Kahneman, for example, Dan
Mm,
Ariely, who have pointed
uh-huh.
out some of the consistency in the lack of rationality that humans exhibit when making many moral and ethical decisions. It seems to me that while fMRI or seeing what's happening in the brain might not be the answer, it seems to me like it would certainly be valuable to see what is happening neurologically at the time.
Yes, that's right. Well, people like Daniel Kahneman are actually fairly supportive of I think they're fairly supportive of fMRI studies. So
Hmm.
I think that some of the the pioneers of these fMRI studies, is sort of applying these studies to moral decision making, in fact, rely on Daniel Kahneman's work on heuristics. So, for example, Joshua Green, he basically makes a claim that when we make deontological judgments, so this is sort of a debate between, there's a sort of an old debate between consequentialists on the one hand and deontology on the other hand. So the consequentialists say that, when we make moral decisions, we should do what's, what will produce the best consequences, right? And the deontologists say that, well, no, consequences matter, but they're not the only things that matter. People have rights, their sort of intentions matter, and so on. And so that debate's been going on for a really long time, and philosophers haven't really been able to settle it. So they try to use something like, they've used something like the trolley problems. So the trolley problem is a case where imagine that there's a trolley going down the track and it's about to hit 5 people. And then you can divert, there's a switch, you can sort of divert the trolley onto a sidetrack where it'll kill 1 person. So the question is, should you switch it onto the sidetrack? Now, most people say, well, 5 versus 1, in that case, they say, yes, we should switch
the utilitarian approach.
Even the deontology, even the non-utilitarians tend to say, not all of them, but about 70-some%, they've done these surveys, but many people say, yes, it's okay to switch it over. The interesting thing is, so here's a variation. It's called the sort of, imagine the trolley's going towards 5 people again. Now this time, there's somebody who's really big on sort of an overhead bridge, and you can push the person off the bridge, and then the trolley will hit the person and stop, thereby saving the 5. And interestingly, many people say that you shouldn't do that because they just sort of have this gut intuitive reaction that you shouldn't do that. And what's really interesting about these 2 cases is that they both involve saving 5 people and killing 1 person, right? And so if you're a utilitarian, you should think that it's the same. In both cases, you should do it, right? Yeah. You should switch and you should push the person. But many deontologists think that, no, you shouldn't push the person. And so the question is, why do they think that? And so Joshua Green from Harvard put subjects under fMRI, and he found that when subjects who think that you shouldn't push the person, off the bridge, when they are responding to that particular dilemma, the amygdala is sort of firing a lot. There's sort of activities in the amygdala. And amygdala, again, is sort of this emotional region of the brain. So using the work of Daniel Kahneman, he sort of says that, well, that's sort of using sort of evolutionarily, it makes sense for human beings to be averse to sort of up-close contact, up-close personal harm. So, in our sort of, during the caveman days, right, people used to club each other. And so naturally we've evolved to be aversive to physical harm, right, pushing people, hitting people and so on. And that's what we're reacting to. So he sort of claims that that's what we're reacting to when we're pushing. But now that we are, in our modern day, that doesn't apply anymore. So we're using a bad heuristic. And so he thinks that the fMRI, in fact, suggests that we should be consequentialists rather than deontologists.
Well, let's pick it up there, and that's exactly where I want to resume our conversation tomorrow. We've been speaking with S. Matthew Liao, who is the director of the Center for Bioethics at New York University. The book is The Right to Be Loved and Moral Brains, the Neuroscience of Morality. We'll continue our conversation tomorrow on that note. We're continuing our conversation today with S. Matthew Liao, who is the director of the Center for Bioethics at New York University, author of The Right to Be Loved and Moral Brains, the Neuroscience of Morality. When we left off yesterday, we had a bit of a conversation about the consideration of consequences in the morality of actions. So let's maybe start on that note today. There are many people who, when faced with whether it's the classic trolley problem or other ethical decisions about whether the means justify the ends, there's often a focus only on consequences. Others tend to focus only on the morality of the action and tend to say, whatever the consequences are, if the action was moral, the consequences don't matter. How can we sort of open a conversation about the different points of view on that?
Yeah, so that's a sort of that's a perennial debate. It's been ongoing. So yesterday we talked about sort of the trolley problem, and one example I gave was this sort of there's a trolley going towards five people, right? And you can switch it onto the sidetrack where it kills one person, right? And many people think that it would be okay to switch it onto the sidetrack to hit one person. I mentioned about 70 some percent. Now, I think that there are other things besides consequences that matter. And so here's a variation of that example where I think could show that it's not just, morality is not just based on consequences. So just take that case again, take that switch case again, right? Now, imagine that the person on the sidetrack is your enemy, right? Or it's this individual's enemy, right? And imagine the person who could do the switching onto the sidetrack doesn't care about saving the five people, right? Instead, this person just wants to kill the person on the sidetrack, and so he switches the trolley onto the sidetrack, and sure enough, it kills the person on the sidetrack. So how should we think about that case? And if you're a consequentialist, you should think, well, the person saved five people, minimize life, and that action should be permissible.
Right, his
But if you're
motivations, the motivations in switching over to someone who is their enemy should not be considered because the consequences are the same.
That's right, and it's good, right? Because you save five, the consequences in this case, saving five people outweighs the badness of killing one person,
Right.
right? But if you thought that motivations matter, then you should think that what this person did was murder, right? This person killed. So it's exactly the same case. The only difference is that the motivations are different in this case. So if you have the intuition, and I think, I don't know what you think, but many people have the intuition that it would be wrong for an individual to switch to try to kill that person on the sidetrack for that reason.
Yeah, I
Right?
mean, as I think about
Yeah,
it, if I imagine scenario one, which is you
yeah,
see this train hurtling towards five people, you run over and flip the switch and you move it away from the five and it kills one person, you have no relationship to any of these six people. It feels
right.
very different than seeing the train hurtling towards five people, noticing that your enemy is strapped to the sidetrack and saying, oh, this is a great opportunity to kill my enemy, running over and flipping the switch. The action is the same, but there's no doubt that it feels very different to me.
Yeah, yeah. And if that's right, so that would suggest that morality is tracking that intentions or motivations could also matter in addition to consequences.
What other examples do we have that might give us maybe a different gut feeling, but still apply to the same consideration? Is there another example we could think of?
There are more sort of controversial examples where, some people talk about organ. Here's a sort of organ transplant case,
Yeah.
right? So imagine that somebody is going to the hospital, a perfectly healthy person goes to the hospital, right? And there are five people in need of five different organ parts, say kidney, lung, liver, et cetera, right? And so now you can kill this person and take the healthy person and take the healthy person's organs and put it into these five people, thereby saving the five people. Should you do it?
I think you shouldn't, but my producer is nodding his head yes, so I think he likes this scenario. No, I'm kidding. No, right. You're choosing to end one person's life to save five lives, which from a consequences perspective is no different than the earlier examples, but now you're talking about something that's completely different.
Yes, yes.
So what objective differences have been sort of established as the reasons why this feels different for many humans, for most humans, I would say?
Good. Yeah. So one explanation some people have given is something called the doctrine of double effect, and this is the idea that intentions sort of whether you're intending to use somebody as a means or whether you foresee that some bad effects is happening, but you're not intending that effect to happen. So let me just explain. So take the trolley case again. In the initial switch case where you just switch it onto the sidetrack, the idea is that when you switch it onto the sidetrack and the person gets killed, you foresee that the person gets killed, but you don't really intend that the person gets killed. Now, why is that? And so a way to think about it is something called the counterfactual test. So imagine that this person, that individual, wasn't on the sidetrack. Then you would have switched it over, right? It would have been a no-brainer.
Sure.
You would have been able to save the five people by switching it over to the sidetrack. But in the case of, say, going back to what we talked about with respect to pushing a person off the bridge, right? In that case, you need that person in order to save the five people. You're using that person as a mere means, right? You're intending to use that person in order to save the five people. And some people think that that's a difference, this idea of the doctrinal double effect. So again, imagine the counterfactual. If the person weren't there, then there would be nothing you could do to save the five people, right? On the bridge, in the bridge, or, over the bridge where,
Sure.
if there's nobody there, right? So.
In the limited time that we have left, I wanted more time to talk about this, but unfortunately we don't have it. The ethics of reproductive technologies, which is an issue, again, that you've studied and written about and spoken about. I'd love for you to give our audience some introduction into some of the ethical questions around new reproductive technologies.
Sure. So there are a bunch of new reproductive technologies on the horizon. So especially something called CRISPR, which is this thing, it's a gene editing tool, which it's basically like a search and replace function. You can just go in and find very specific parts in the genes and delete or replace or add different genes to it, to that part of the gene, the genome. And this enables people to possibly remove diseases. So some labs have been trying to use it for cancer, for HIV, for Alzheimer, for schizophrenia, et cetera, et cetera. But it also has the potential of allowing us to design human beings. And that raises all sorts of ethical issues. Should we be doing this at all? So some people think that it would be very bad. It would be we would be playing God to be sort of interfering with human nature like this. Other people worry about the unintended consequences because this would involve germline modification. And those genes could be passed on to future offsprings. It would be very hard to control. And also, but other people say that, well, maybe we have an obligation to do it. We have an obligation to produce children with the best chance of having the best life possible. So sort of there are different ethical issues around that. My own view is that I think we should try to make sure that all of us have enough of what I call, something I call the fundamental capacities for being able to pursue a good life. And so these are sort of various, so what are these capacities? we need to be able to think, to be able to interact with other people, to be able to move about, and so there are sort of different core capacities that we need. And so I think that genetic modification shouldn't tinker with our fundamental capacities. But if there are sort of other things that we want, things like, we want to be stronger, be more intelligent, et cetera, my own view is that that's not as controversial. On its own, there could be other reasons for being worried about these type of modifications, things like equality of access, like who gets these type of enhancements, et cetera. But that's a slightly different type of issue.
Well, all issues that are going to be increasingly discussed over the next years, that's for sure. We've been speaking with S. Matthew Liao, who is the director of the Center for Bioethics at New York University. The book is The Right to Be Loved and Moral Brains, the Neuroscience of Morality. It's been really great speaking to you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really fun speaking with you as well. Thank you.